of the things we love most, we often think about things we grew to love in our formative years. This is often true for music, vacation destinations, loves, and, yes, motorcycles. At least this is true for me. Of the nearly 900 different motorcycles I've put between my legs during my riding career, it's Yamaha's splendiferous RZ500 that shines brightest in my heart. In 1984, the RZ500cc two-stroke V4 mimicked the one in Kenny Roberts' factory Grand Prix race bike, creating one of the first fully fair-directly racer street bikes. The RZ500, however, wasn't legally available in the US, thanks to the ever-tightening noose of emissions regulations that kept two-stroke oil burners like the RZ away from American consumption. This wasn't a problem for me, though, as I grew up in Canada where two smokers were welcomed, lots of trees and sparse population density up north, I had fallen in love with motorcycles by riding off-road, graduating to a Honda CR125R when the earth was cooling back in 1985. Meanwhile, a few friends were getting into street bikes, and I began to envy how they could simply ride their motorcycles out of their garages instead of first strapping them down in the back of a truck or a trailer. My buddies Ken and Dale offered up the gateway drugs. First was a Honda CB400F, followed shortly thereafter by two smokers like Yamaha's RD400 and Kawasaki's KH400. The exciting power delivery nature of the road and KH was familiar to me, as I had only ever owned two-stroke dirt bikes. However, my parents warned me that purchasing a street bike would result in a new residence outside their cozy basement I was living in, so I continued to sate my moto aspirations solely in the dirt. Meantime, I took a spin on a friend's Honda Interceptor 500, a wonderful four-stroke sport bike with a sweet V4 engine. It was the most lovely machine I had ever piloted, and I lusted for it. But then I was able to get behind the handlebars of Ken's latest bike, an RZ500, and my Grand Prix fantasies kicked into high gear. Starting it was part of its theater, as its kickstart-only provisions were actually a luxury relative to a GP bike. When I heard it cackle to life after a swift kick, visions of Kenny Roberts danced through my head because I knew this machine was indeed something quite special. Spurting oily smoke from its pair of undertail stingers, perhaps the first such exhaust on a street bike, the RZ looked like the racetrack refugee it pretended to be, aside from its headlight and fenders. It was a street-going replica of the YZR500 factory racer ridden by King Kenny during the 1983 GP season. Powered by a liquid-cooled 50-degree V4 housed in a perimeter-style box section frame, the RZ500 was a mid-1980s sport rider's wet dream. With its twin-crank layout, the engine essentially functions as a pair of 180-degree parallel twins geared together. However it worked, the engine sounded glorious, with four cylinders spitting out a cacophony of racket that sounded like it was either going to blow up or rocket it into low Earth orbit. Its power band is, at its slow end, surprisingly docile, with less breathing of fire than might be expected despite its servo-controlled Yamaha power valve system intended to bolster mid-range power. But get it up on its pipe, around 7,000 revolutions per minute, and the V4 lunges forward with an urgency that seems almost frighteningly supernatural. Although its 80 horsepower at the rear wheel seems almost quaint today, its power delivery is guaranteed to keep your attention. I simply had to have one. And that's how a stupidly fast and barely predictable two-stroke GP replica sport bike became my first street motorcycle. I highly recommend street bike noobs begin with something a bit less savage. Today, lo the decades that have passed, I vividly recall the feeling of holding on the throttle at only about 20% in second gear and just letting the revs climb without additional throttle input. Revs gathered sluggishly at first, more like a GT80 than a GP monster, gathering RPM slightly quicker as the tack needle ascended. And again. And at 6,500 revolutions per minute but still with 20% throttle, Revs leapfrogged over each other like a power drill and quickly induced wheelies without even trying, culminating in a crescendo of ring-a-ding noise screaming to 10,000 revolutions per minute that would make King Kenny proud. There is simply nothing else quite like it. It is that intense and oddly mystical feeling I'm reminded of whenever I'm asked a motojournalist's most frequently posed question, "What's your dream bike?" For me, it would be that invigorating V4 engine stuffed inside a modern sport bike chassis. You see, for as wild and fun as the RZ500 is, its steel-framed chassis and odd wheel sizes weren't able to measure up to its motor. This became more apparent in 1985, when Suzuki introduced its lighter aluminum-framed RG500 Gamma, despite the two four-cylinder two-stroke motors producing similar horsepower. Although I dreamed of my RZ-powered dream sport bike, the upward trending prices of RZ500s have kept my dreams in fantasyland and out of reality. My pretend world meshed with my real life a few weeks ago while at the Circuit of the Americas for a ride on BMW's Uber Superbike, the carbon-framed and wheeled HP4 Race, which was the most capable sport bike I'd ever ridden. After my sessions were over, I strolled through the pits and ran across a close approximation of my dream machine, owned by my newest best friend, Paul Stamper. Stamper was attending the track day with his RZ500R, a higher-spec Japanese market RZ that used hand-welded aluminum for its box section frame instead of the RZ's steel chassis. Despite the bike's exotic pedigree, Stamper made several comprehensive mods his RZ to make it more suitable for his track day use. The most obvious update is the adoption of Yamaha R6 suspension, swing arm, brakes and wheels, a major upgrade from the RZ's twig-like 37mm fork, with flawed anti-dive system, and its oddball 16-18-inch front, rear wheels. The early generation R6 components are steps behind the contemporary leading edge, but they are more than capable for the power and weight of the RZV. Stamper says the RZ's lightly modded motor cranks out 90 horsepower to its tire, and the bike scales in at a tidy 360 pounds with its tank full. My heartstrings were yanked mightily as Stamper walked me around his RZ. I couldn't help imagining what it would be like to feel that two-stroke V4 thrusting me around the marvelous COTA track, aided by brakes, suspension and tires that are generations ahead of the bike's original moribund components. Stamper literally had the key to my dream. It's said that you create opportunities by asking for them, so I did. And Stamper graciously told me I was welcome to take his bike for a spin around the GP circuit. My mind raced with anticipation as I hastily threw on my leathers while Stamper took his RZ out for a warm-up lap before handing it over to me. Would my lofty, nostalgia-tinted expectations be met, or would my blast from my past be a disappointing letdown after riding modern superbikes like the amazing $78,000 HP4 Race I had sampled just an hour earlier? Hearing the RZ500 cackling in pit lane while I slipped on my gloves brought back a flood of memories from my long-ago formative years. It sounded just as awesome as I remembered, with a soft, snowmobile-like purr at idle that transforms into a shrieking high pitch at the blip of the throttle. Some might say that a two-stroke motor sounds unrefined relative to a four-cycle engine, and that might be true. But, to my ears, no other motorbike engine sounds as electrifying as the RZ's. Engaging the clutch reminded me of the RZ stall first gear, which made drag race-style starts challenging on the street but would be no issue at COTA. The transmission swap scares with a crudeness that would be unacceptable on a modern bike. These foibles, however, didn't bother me in the least, as I was so thrilled to revisit familiar but distant feelings from the RZ. Even the seat, which is otherwise nearly inconsequential to a motorcycle, felt familiar to my butt cheeks, another reminder of the street bike glory days from my youth.